Hi, welcome to the second part in our segment related to contemporary art. As you all know, we're going to be looking at a variety of different mediums, painting, sculpture, monuments. And what you'll see is that these artists are not only inspired by other historical references in art history, but also experimenting with different types of media that we haven't seen before. And obviously, there's going to be lots of issues related to social commentary, gender issues, power relationships, politics, you name it. Art encompasses it all. So this is kind of a quiet sort of painting that we're looking at by Song Sunam, entitled Summer Trees, 1979. When we look at this, it might make us think of abstract expressionism. But Song Sunam also is a Korean artist and sort of embracing that heritage as well. So you probably noticed the very broad vertical parallel brushstrokes of ink, and that is something that comes from this tradition of Asian art. These beautiful ink drawings. We haven't had a chance to look at any ancient Korean art, but hopefully I will be able to go back and show you some examples. And they create these very velvety tones, and I think that's something to remember as well, that he's really interested not just in lines and composition, but sort of how these tones relate to each other. Some of the lines have these very feathery edges that reveal them to be pale washes applied to very wet paper, while the darkest streaks appear to show both ink and paper were nearly dry. You can kind of see over here, it kind of looks that way. The forms overlap and stop just short at the bottom edge of the paper, suggesting a sense of shallow space, which is important. We've talked about this idea of negative space being just as important as the actual mark making on paintings and drawings. And so, again, this kind of space creates, I think, a sense of tension and a little bit of imbalance. Only a practiced hand can control ink with such simplicity and impact. The painting exudes psychological power despite its relatively modest proportion. It is only a little more than 2 feet high. So unlike some of the abstract expressionist art that we looked at in the 50s, this is not quite as large scale. This is another example he has done from 1985. This is another variation of trees. And Song's exploration of tone, the shades of black and gray, and the effects produced by the marks of the brush, the wet paper, and dripping ink have led some scholars to think that these abstract, formal qualities are the real subject of this very modern-looking work. But it's important that we look at the title, because the title is referring to the natural world. Song created Summer Trees in 1979, but he at least made 2 more similar paintings, one that we're looking at, I think now, in 1986, and then he did a second one painted in 2000, which I could not find, but I'm sure it looks pretty similar to this. He did not fully embrace abstraction by leaving the work untitled until 2000. His title and even his decision to create a work in ink shows us, though, that he's clearly addressing issues of contemporary art. Not only is he addressing issues of contemporary art, but his work is deeply rooted in tradition, him being a Korean artist as well. So here is an example of a Korean ancient work. It's a beautiful ink scroll done in the 1300s. So to choose the medium of ink on paper was important for the artist, a leader of Korea's Suma Wa, or Oriental ink movement of the 1980s, and I'll spell that for you, S-U-M-U-K-H-W-A. Sumawaka is the Korean pronunciation for the Chinese word ink wash painting, also called literate painting. The literatus can be defined as a scholar poet or scholar artist, a type of ideal man that emerged in China in the 11th century or before. Chinese poetry was considered the noblest art of the ink wash painting, with its twin, because writing a poem and making a picture using the same tools and techniques, one resulting in words, the other a picture, was important. In their simplicity and reductiveness, the style of ink wash paintings created centuries ago often seem to match Western notions of abstract art as well. So we're looking at one of those examples. In Chinese poetry, mountainous landscapes and plants that grow in them serve as metaphors for the ideal qualities of the literos himself. Qualities such as loyalty, intelligence, spirituality, and strength in adversity. The world the literatus wants to live in is one of beauty, deep in nature, away from the center of power and money. These themes provide painters with a library of motifs. From 1970 to the 90s, Song created many such landscapes executed unconventionally, with and without titles. Summer trees may also reference a traditional theme. A group of pine trees can symbolize a gathering of friends of upright character. I'll go back to his painting. Whatever his intention was, with this title, Song was clearly alluding to the special world of the literati, Literati. Highly educated and a respected professor, he stood among the modern literati of Korea. Song's interest in abstraction and the formal properties of ink have led some art historians to attribute the inspiration of his work to that of American artists like Morris Louis, who we're looking at one of his images here, who used the medium of acrylic resin on canvas in his stripe paintings of the 1960s, which resemble Song's work of later decades, such as Summer Trees. But in Korea, during the 1980s, there was a tension between the influence of Western art and the use of oil paint, whether traditional or contemporary in style, and traditional Korean art that used an East Asian style, the vocabulary of traditional motifs, and the medium of ink for calligraphy and painting. Some felt very strongly that the materials and styles of Western art did not express his identity as a Korean. Sumawaka provided Song, and this is this movement in ink, and his circle with a way to express their Korean identity. Since antiquity, the country had taken great pride in political and cultural distinctiveness that was recognized through Asia. Yet the 20th century had brought humiliating trauma, the end of Korea's ancient monarchy, colonization by the Japanese who had attempted to obliterate the Korean language, mass destruction during the Korean War that took place from 1950 to 1953, and the partitioning of the nation. In South Korea, where Song lived, the country was healing but endured authoritarian government and student unrest. People lived in constant fear of hostility from North Korea. We know how crazy Kim Jong-il is, and that's a pretty dismal place, I would think, to exist. Song is fortunate to be in South Korea for protection. They accepted a conspicuous American military presence, but this cast modernization in a decidedly westernized light. So this idea, this movement called Summa Kawa, this sort of movement in ink, that the literati embraced, presented a compelling antidote to the psychological displacement felt by Song's circle of artists and intellectuals, a model individual of character and moral compass no matter what challenges life presents, in a way of expressing those ideas through his iconic tools of ink and brush. Summer Trees, with its allusion to friendship and balmy seasons, could be Song's statement of optimism and the rediscovery of traditional values recast for modern times. So it is very important that we look at this and understand that this is a painting that might seem very Western to us, and modern, but it is deeply rooted in tradition in the sense of this use of India ink and the Sumawa tradition in ink painting. All right, the next artist we're going to be looking at is Magdalena Ibachano. This is a sculpture entitled Ontogeny 3. Here we see some unusual materials: burlap, resin, wood, nails, and string. So a lot different than marble and stone, or bronze, or some of those other traditional materials. And this is a quote from her. Becoming, between myself and the material with which I create, no tool intervenes. I select it with my hands. I shape it with my hands. My hands transmit energy to it. In translating idea into form, they always pass on to it something that eludes conceptualization. They reveal the unconsciousness. So, in understanding her artwork, it is important for us to understand, in a lot of cases, the way some of these artists did grow up in their biographies. At the beginning of World War II, Ibachano, then a young girl, witnessed German tanks enter her family's estate. At one point, a drunken soldier burst into her house and, in Ibachano's presence, shot off her mother's arm. In 1944, the family was forced to flee the advances of the Soviet army and ended up in Warsaw, where the artist still lives and works. As a teenager, Ibachano worked as a nursing assistant in a makeshift hospital, caring for the wounded, while also finishing her high school education. Her family lost everything during the war and had to hide their aristocratic roots when the nobility became the enemy in post-war communist Poland. Ibachano remembered, we as a family lost our identity. We were depraved of our social position and thrown out of society. So this is another theme that we're seeing, this idea of identity, and what does that mean to you in a sense of, what makes up your identity? And that's something that I want you guys to think about. We were punished for being rich, so I had to hide my background. I had to lie. I had to invent it. Magdalena Ibachano was born in 1930 and spent her early years on the family estate about 200 miles east of Warsaw. There she often played in the nearby forest, an experience that later influenced the materials she used in her work. Her family had both Tartar and aristocratic roots. The term Tartar has a complex history, but in this case, the artist's father was a descendant of Abaqua Khan, a 13th century second Khan, the 13th century second Khan of Persia. So she did have this very fancy pedigree. After the war, Ibachano graduated the Academy of Fine Arts in Warsaw in 1955, post-war Poland, and was part of the Soviet bloc and had Poland was part of the Soviet bloc and had a communist government. Social realism was the style taught in art schools during this era, and initially Ibachano experimented with textiles and weavings in order to avoid it. Social realism demanded images of smiling workers and a perfected society, and although Ibachano disliked the style, she was ultimately required to adopt it in order to obtain a degree and enter the Polish Artists Union. So this is kind of similar in a way to constructivism, where we saw, Soviet artists, trying to create art that epitomized and made the Soviet Union look greater than it really was. Stepanova, she was the artist that we studied during that period. And so, again, she had to sort of adopt this style to become, to get her degree and enter the Polish Arts Union, which was a step required of all professional sculptors. Explain socialist realism, To explain socialist realism, it was a style of art, found especially in the Soviet Union, China and other communist nations from the 1930s until the 1980s. It's images of happy, healthy, and productive workers celebrating labor's roles in making the state strong. It uses bright colors and a bold, easily understood graphics, and was often used as propaganda. Throughout her life, Ibachano Woods has continued to live in Poland despite the communist government that held power there until 1989 and the hardships that she and her fellow Poles endured. After Joseph Stalin's death in 1953, there was considerable hardship in Warsaw, but also a flourish of the arts. Ibachano Woods attended gatherings of artists, intellectuals, scientists, and politicians in a one-room apartment of the Polish constructivist painter, Henryk Stawacki. So this is another example of Magdalena Ibachano Woods' work. So in 1967, she began to create forms made with fabric and tapestry. She became well known for work she called Ibachons, which you see here, a series of monumental fiber sculptures that created the framework for her later work. Ibachon sculptures refer to clothing but are not functional. They hang from the ceiling, and although they allude to human figures, they also reference the natural world, some gently swimming, suggesting the rocking of underwater vegetation or the flight of birds. So you can actually see here how it's suspended. We'll look at some of her later work. In the 1970s, Pagano Woods began experimenting with other materials, including burlap, string, and cotton gauze. In 1974, she began to form figures by dipping burlap and string into resin, which she then pressed into a plaster mold. Sometimes she took a cast from the body of a friend for these forms. The figures are hollow and repetitious, as seen here, and seated figures. And then another installation, sort of sculpture installation she did called backs. So this is another view of Ontogeny 3. Let me go back and show you the other view. So here are the two different views, one from the side and front and from the back. So the body as a structure became increasingly important to Ibachano Woods, and she visited laboratories to learn more about dissection and the construction of the human body. The effect of seated figures and backs can be chilling and is often understood as expressing, we'll go back to those, dehumanization in the 20th century. In these works, the same shape is repeated, but the surface of each figure has an individual texture, the result of Ibachano Woods' unique handling of the materials. Ontogeny 3 uses the same model torso shell that Ibachano Woods employed in her sculptural series, backs. Again, I'll go back to it. The piece is made of burlap, resin, wood, nails, and string. Unlike the back series, however, in which the figures sat directly on the floor, the Ontogeny torsos are seated on low stretchers of wooden logs, perhaps filling in for the lost legs. Ibachano Woods' figures are mostly androgynous, with their sexual characteristics de-emphasized. The artist wants the viewer to focus on the humanity of the figure rather than its gender. At the same time, the fragmentary nature of the figure is important, perhaps a reflection of the time she spent helping in the hospital during World War II and her memories of the attack on her mother. A distinguished feature of all of the burlap cast is the wrinkled skin and imperfections of backbones, musculature, and veins that we can see here, particularly in this image. The bodies, or body parts more accurately, are intended to be seen in the round, as the hollow interior is as much a part of the piece as the molded exterior. So again, this is very important, and if you do confront this on the AP exam, this is something to be, to know that, not just the shell that we see here, but this sort of empty space and what that could symbolize is very important. So space is significant as mass in these works. So again, this idea of mass, something solid, but also this idea of negative space is just as important. Pagano Woods draws on her personal history, but her sculptures possess an ambiguity that encourages multiple interpretations that speak broadly to human experience. Ontogeny 3 alludes to the brutality of war and the totalitarian state. The body is a husk without arms, legs, or head, is an expression of suffering, both mournful and disturbing. Okay, so the next artist we're going to be looking at is Yu Bing. I think that's how you say his name. So as usual, we're going to be looking at experimental art. What you're seeing here is an installation he did called Book from the Sky, and you can see these sort of hand-printed books are sort of draped from the ceiling, like traditional scrolls, and you know, this has been shown in other venues as well. But this is a term, you know, we talk about different mediums, you know, sculpture, painting, and this is, some of you have asked me this idea of installation art, and this is, I think, a good example of that. All right, so again, I want to stress too that we're looking at global contemporary art, so, you know, we are looking at a variety of different artists from all over the world. Yu Bing is best known for his work, A Book from the Sky, and he is Chinese. After graduating from the Central Academy of Art in Beijing, A Book from the Sky is the title of a book produced in the style of fine editions from the Song and Ming dynasty. So again, here we have an artist that is also looking back at his heritage. But the thing with these books that he's created, or this text that he's created, they're filled with entirely meaningless glyphs designed to resemble traditional Chinese characters. The book, which consists of 4 volumes totaling 604 pages, was printed in a single print run of 126 copies between 1987 and 1991, and was first publicly exhibited in October in 1988 in Beijing's China Art Gallery. So this is what you're looking at. Oh, sorry that was up. So this is a title page from the book, and you can see that it looks very traditional, but these characters don't mean anything. They're pseudo, you know, Chinese characters, so they're just they have no meaning. So again, we're playing with this idea of reading and text, but then also that, you know, something that seems beautiful and looks beautiful and is meant to be read, but you can't read it. So again, there's lots of interesting interpretations that you could come away with that. So the book is composed using a set of 4,000 characters, as this is roughly the number of characters in common usage in modern written Mandarin. These characters were designed on the basis of the Kanxi radicals, and that is spelled Kangxi, and then radicals, so that in terms of density or strokes and frequency of occurrence, they appear on the page to be real characters in addition to these pages. And facsimile numbers were indicated using tally marks based on Chinese characters. The characters were carved into individual pieces of movable type made from pear wood in a style slightly squatter than that of song type bases. So again, these are just, you know how we look at on your computer, you know, fonts, you know, sort of the same idea, these sort of different styles of fonts. Initially, Yu himself typeset sample pages and took them for printing to a factory in the village of Haiying. This was one of the last remaining traditional printing factories in China, which after the Cultural Revolution mainly produced state-sponsored reprints of classical text using pre-revolutionary wood blocks. Later, workers at the factory typeset the pages by referring to a model book prepared by Yu, which contain just meaningless symbols, and have been placed in a one-to-one correspondence with his 4,000 pseudo-Chinese characters. So it is in this piece that made it obvious to him that art can evoke a dissimilar response if it addresses pregnant issues. The sensitive themes confronted here are the value of traditional culture in a modern society, the reliability of knowledge, and the futility of existence. A Book from the Sky is an installation consisting of an arrangement of book scrolls and large printed sheets of paper typeset from thousands of small wooden blocks, into each of which Yu has carved an imaginary Chinese character. In all, Yu carved between 3,000 and 4,000 invented characters to approximate the number of Chinese characters in frequent use. He then had this new characters typeset and printed, and the printed pages bound or mounted into book scrolls and large sheets. As with Book from the Sky, Yu had deconstructed the written word, negating the basis of Chinese culture while simultaneously constructing a solemn, dignified world where the familiar is invalidated. The pessimism expressed in A Book from the Sky exceeds even the denial of Chinese culture, propounding the futility of all human endeavor as represented by Yu's expenditure of 3 years of laborious effort to create a superficially meaningless series of books, scrolls, and posters. Until its exhibition, Yu Bing had no idea how quite passionate the reactions to his work would have been, or how widely varying. When it was first shown in public in his solo exhibition at the Chinese Art Gallery in Beijing in 1988, it drew immediate attention. Beijing artistic circles lauded it as a major work of the New Wave art movement, deserving recognition for its quality of workmanship and the dedication involved in its creation. Got some other examples. A little more than a year later, Wenyi Bao published an article criticizing A Book from the Sky as the embodiment of all the bourgeois liberal tendencies of the New Wave movement. And so he was criticizing it. It further stated that A Book from the Sky represented the phenomenon of ghosts pounding the wall, which is a term called Jiyu Da Kuang, in human thinking, actively and artistically creative. So he's sort of beating, I guess, kind of a dead horse, and is what that means. The phrase ghost pounding the wall referred to a story about a traveler walking in the dark, thinking he was covering a great distance, but actually walking in circles, as if enclosed within a ghostly circular wall. This reading of A Book from the Sky was the polar opposite of the artistic community's reading. The extreme disparity possibly between different interpretations of a single work of art was thus made exceedingly clear to Yu Bing. It is around this time that Yu first saw the potential of extracting multiple readings from his work. Yu's move to the United States provided a change of venue and a markedly different audience. This situation almost inevitably produced a new set of interpretations, which the artist encouraged. So here we have a work of art, and again, in terms of how someone, interprets this, obviously someone that is Chinese is going to interpret this much differently than how an American would, and obviously different class and, people of different socioeconomic status, in China obviously interpreted this piece in different ways, both positive and negative. So here you can see, this is actually what the carved type for the book, some of it looked like. I know you're probably like, what is that? That is our next work that we'll be talking about. So, transferring the debate concerning Yu Bing's work to the West had altered work's meaning in ways that he could not have predicted. With A Book from the Sky, the Western audience did not expect to be able to read the invented characters and therefore missed the central experience of the Chinese audience. So, again, here the Chinese audience would have been looking at this, trying to read it and then realizing that these were meaningless characters, where here, the Westerners probably appreciated more for the beauty of the of the mark making and sort of the way these meaningless characters were constructed. And so there wasn't this impulse for Westerners to try to read it. For Western viewers, the installation's austere beauty and the amount of painstaking labor it involved assumed primacy. And so that's what a Western audience really appreciated. They didn't care that it was readable or not. A Book from the Sky achieved added significance in the West as the embodiment of the immigration of some of China's most creative young people to the West. All right, so I am going to stop here. It's been about 30 minutes. So we are going to be looking at some other works of art. We're going to be looking at Jeff Koons, just to give you, maybe inspire you to continue watching, which his work is pretty intense. So stay tuned for part 3.